Janitor dragged a bleeding stranger through emergency doors until she saw his fangs and the ancient crest tattooed on his wrist. The vampire king everyone thought was dead gripped her hand and whispered a single word, "Stay." Now every vampire council in the city knows her face, and the king who hasn't spoken in decades refuses to let her leave his side. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Maya Torres had been invisible for 6 years, and she preferred it that way because invisible people didn't get hurt, and they didn't get noticed, and most importantly, they didn't get their kindness thrown back in their faces like the last time she'd tried to matter to anyone. So when she heard the wet gasping outside the service entrance at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, she almost kept mopping, almost pretended the sound was just wind or rats or anything except another human being bleeding out against the dumpsters. But her hands moved before her brain could stop them, and she shoved the service door open into October rain and rust smell. And there he was, collapsed against the green metal like discarded trash, filthy coat soaked through, shirt shredded to reveal ribs that shouldn't be visible through that much torn skin. And she knew. Protocol said call security, call the ER, don't touch the patient, but the nearest emergency room was 12 blocks away, and his breathing sounded like paper tearing, and she'd spent 6 years cleaning up after people who didn't see her, and she was so tired of being the kind of person who looked away. She hooked her arms under his shoulders, and he was heavier than he looked. Dead weight, except he wasn't dead yet. And he made a sound that might have been protest, but she ignored it because nobody died on her watch. Not tonight. Not when she could still feel her own heartbeat hammering against her ribs, like proof she was still capable of caring about something. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed like angry wasps, and the ammonia smell from her mop bucket made her eyes water as she half dragged him down the corridor, his boots leaving wet streaks on linoleum she'd just cleaned, and she didn't care. She didn't care about protocol or cleanliness or the fact that her supervisor would write her up for this. She just needed him to keep breathing. She hauled him into the supply closet, the one with the cot where the night nurses sometimes napped, and lowered him onto scratchy white sheets that immediately bloomed red. And that's when she saw them. The fangs behind split lips, elongated canines catching the light like polished bone, and her brain stuttered because fangs weren't real, except they were right there in his mouth, and she should run, should scream, should do anything except press gauze to the worst of the wounds. But her hands kept moving like they belonged to someone braver. His left wrist flopped against the cot edge and she grabbed it to check his pulse, not thinking, just reacting, and that's when she saw the crest. Black ink, stark against pale skin. A design she recognized from the museum plaques she'd studied during her lunch breaks. When the hospital got too loud, and she needed to remember, the city had history beyond sickness. The Draev sigil, all sharp angles and crowned serpents, belonging to the vampire king everyone said died in 1989, back when she was 3 years old, and the world still made sense. Her fingers touched the crest, and it felt warm, warmer than skin should be, and his hand locked around her wrist with impossible strength, bones grinding together in a grip that should have broken her but didn't, and his eyes opened, gold instead of human brown or blue, gold like old coins at the bottom of a well, and his voice came out rough and unused, scraped raw from decades of silence. Just one word that sounded like gravel and breaking glass, and every lonely night she'd ever survived. Stay. Then his eyes rolled back and his grip loosened, and he was unconscious again, chest barely moving, and Maya stood there with her wrist throbbing and her heart trying to climb out of her throat, because what the hell had she just done? What the hell was he? And why did that single word feel less like a command and more like the first honest thing anyone had said to her in years? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the vibration startling against her hip, and she fumbled it out with shaking hands, expecting her supervisor or maybe security wondering where she'd gone, but the notification was from an unknown number, a photo of her own face taken from a high angle. Security camera quality, grainy but unmistakable, and below it a single line of text that made her stomach drop through the floor. The council knows, run or serve. She stared at the screen until the words stopped making sense, until they were just shapes and threats. And then she looked back at the man on the cot, at the crest on his wrist, at the rise and fall of his chest that proved he was still alive because of her. And she thought about running, thought about walking out of the hospital and getting on a bus and disappearing into a city that had never noticed her anyway. But her feet stayed planted on the linoleum and her hands stayed pressed to the gauze, and she heard herself whisper, "I don't care what you are, nobody dies on my watch." The fluorescent lights flickered once, a stutter that made shadows jump across the walls, and she wondered if that was him or just the hospital's ancient electrical system. Wondered if saving him had been the bravest thing she'd ever done, or the stupidest. Wondered if kindness was ever anything except a target painted on your back. She needed help, and she couldn't call security, because what would she say? There's a vampire bleeding out in the supply closet. And also, I think I just got drafted into some kind of supernatural surveillance state, so she tucked her phone away and grabbed the cot handles and wheeled him toward the ER bay. Screw protocol, screw invisibility, screw every instinct that told her to protect herself first, because he'd said stay, and she'd already decided the answer was yes, even if she didn't understand why. The ER was chaos as usual. 3 ambulances unloading at once, nurses shouting about blood pressure and IV lines, and Maya wheeled her patient past the triage desk, hoping no one would stop her. But Dr. Patel looked up from his clipboard, and his eyes went wide, not at the blood or the wounds, but at something else. And he crossed the distance between them in 4 long strides and yanked back the coat to expose the crest, and went pale. Actually pale, color draining from his brown skin like someone had pulled a plug. He grabbed Maya's shoulder hard enough to bruise and said, "That's not possible. He's been dead for 30 years. And Maya wanted to ask how a human doctor recognized a dead vampire king's tattoo, but Patel was already barking orders, get him to trauma 2, no residents, no students, just him and one nurse he trusted. And Maya tried to follow, but Patel blocked her path and said, "You touched the crest, didn't you?" And she nodded because lying seemed pointless when her wrist still tingled, where the vampire's fingers had locked around bone. And Patel closed his eyes like he was mourning someone who hadn't died yet and said, "Then you're already marked. They'll know everywhere you go until the bond fades, if it fades." And Maya asked how long, and Patel said, "I don't know. I've never seen anyone survive touching a royal blood mark." And then he was gone, disappeared into trauma 2 with the vampire king who shouldn't exist. And Maya stood in the corridor with blood on her hands and a phone full of threats, and the words "stay still" echoing in her skull like a promise or a prayer, or the beginning of the end of the only life she'd ever known. The ER lights hummed above her head, and monitors beeped their steady rhythms, and somewhere behind the plastic curtains, someone was crying, and someone else was laughing, and the world kept spinning like nothing had changed. But Maya's wrist throbbed where he'd held her, and her phone buzzed again. Another message, just 2 words this time. "We're coming." And she thought about running, really thought about it, pictured herself walking out through the service entrance into October rain and never looking back. But her feet carried her to trauma 2 instead. And she pressed her face to the wire glass window and watched Dr. Patel cut away the rest of the vampire's shirt, watched the crest on his wrist pulse once with dim gold light, watched his chest rise and fall and rise again, and she thought, "I saved you. I don't even know your name, but I saved you, and that has to mean something. That has to count for something in whatever game I just got drafted into." And the word stay wrapped around her ribs like armor or chains, and she couldn't tell the difference anymore, couldn't tell if she'd been brave or foolish, or if maybe in the end those were the same thing, and when the lights flickered again, she didn't look away. Maya was leaning against the corridor wall, trying to convince herself that the last hour had been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and cleaning supply fumes when hospital security arrived at 12:15, and she knew immediately they weren't human, because humans didn't move like that, didn't glide down linoleum with footsteps that made no sound, didn't wear scrubs that fit too perfectly over frames that belonged in marble museums. And the woman on the left had eyes like green glass, and a smile that showed too many teeth and said, "Maya Torres, we need to discuss the doctrine of witnessed return." And Maya's brain stuttered on the word doctrine because that sounded official, sounded like something with rules and consequences, and the man on the right added in a voice smooth as oil, "When a declared dead royal is seen alive, the witness either enters service or is disappeared to preserve political stability." And he said disappeared, the way someone else might say relocated or rehomed, casual and final. And Maya felt her spine go rigid because she hadn't survived 6 years of night shifts and loneliness just to get erased by people who thought human lives were administrative problems. She opened her mouth to tell them exactly where they could shove their doctrine when the trauma bay door swung open and he was there, the vampire king she'd dragged through rain and blood, standing upright despite the bandages wrapped around his ribs. Despite the fact that 2 hours ago he'd been unconscious and dying, and his voice came out like gravel scraped over iron. "She is under my protection. The law stands," and the two vampires in scrubs went very still, the way prey animals freeze when they realize the predator is bigger than they thought. And then they were gone. Not walking away, but simply absent. And Maya was alone in the corridor with a man who'd been dead for 30 years, except he clearly wasn't. She rounded on him and demanded, "What the hell is the doctrine of witnessed return? What is service? And why do you get to decide if I'm protected or disappeared?" And he leaned against the doorframe like standing cost him everything, and said in halting sentences that came out slow and deliberate, like each word was a stone he had to lift. "I faked my death in 1989 because I was tired of being the reason people died, tired of the throne and the crown, and the endless political games where every decision I made got someone killed. And the council I left behind twisted vampire law into a surveillance state, turned protection into control. And your kindness resurrected me politically because every vampire in the city knows I'm alive now, and you're the proof. You touched my crest, and the bond marked you, and now they know your face, and they won't stop until you're either bound to me or eliminated." Maya stared at him and felt fury rising hot in her chest because she'd saved his life, and apparently that meant she'd signed herself up for some kind of supernatural witness protection program. Except the protection came with chains, and she said, "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be marked or hunted or turned into a political problem. I just didn't want you to die." And he met her eyes, and she saw exhaustion there, centuries of it. And he said, "I know, I'm sorry. Speaking is hard for me. I haven't used my voice in decades." And that stopped her cold, because she could hear the truth in it, could hear how each sentence cost him. And some part of her that was still capable of sympathy, despite the terror thought. What kind of king goes silent for 36 years? At 1:50 in the morning, they relocated to his safe house, and Maya didn't want to go, but he explained quietly that the hospital wasn't safe, that the two vampires in scrubs had been a warning, not a threat, and the real danger would come soon. And she followed him out the service entrance into October cold that bit through her scrubs, because what else was she going to do? Run into a city that apparently had vampires in the hospital security and the government and God knows where else. They walked 6 blocks through streets slick with rain, and he moved carefully like his ribs hurt, but his hand stayed near her elbow, not touching but present, and she found herself cataloging details she shouldn't notice, the way his coat hung open despite the cold, the scars on his knuckles visible in streetlight, the fact that he kept checking over his shoulder like he expected pursuit. The brownstone was an old city, tucked between a closed tailor shop and a building with boarded windows, and it looked abandoned from the outside. But when he unlocked the door, The interior was chaos in a specific way. Organized mess, walls lined floor to ceiling with books and maps covered in red X's. And Maya asked what the X's meant, and he said, failed assassination attempts, 83 through 89. I was documenting who wanted me dead before I decided it was easier to just let them think they'd won. The air inside smelled like old paper and something metallic. Blood, maybe, faint but persistent, and dust motes swirled in moonlight that came through cracked shutters, and Maya tried to leave, walked straight to the door, and reached for the handle, but he was there, not grabbing her, but standing close enough that she'd have to push past him, and his gold eyes were pleading, and he said, "Please don't. Please just stay until dawn, until we can talk to the council." And she stepped back and tried again 10 minutes later, and again he was there. Proximity instead of force, asking instead of ordering. And the third time she wheeled on him and said, "You can't keep me here. I'm not your prisoner." And he said, "You're right. You're not. But if you leave, you'll be running with no plan into a city full of predators who know your face, and I can't. I won't let that happen to you because of me." She wanted to scream at him, but the words died in her throat because he wasn't wrong. She had no plan, no idea where to run or how to hide from people who could apparently track her through some kind of mystical blood mark, so she stayed, furious and confused, and hating that staying felt less like surrender, and more like the only option that didn't end with her dead in an alley. He gave her his coat, the long leather one that smelled like rain and old smoke, and she pulled it around her shoulders because the brownstone was cold and the coat was warm, and she told herself that's all it was. Practicality, not comfort, but when she caught him watching her wear it, something flickered across his face that looked almost like relief. He sat across from her at a table covered in maps and said, "I need to teach you the rules. The first one is this. A royal's direct protection cannot be challenged without council vote, which means you're safe as long as you stay close to me." And Maya laughed, bitter and sharp, and said, "So I'm safe as long as I'm your shadow, as long as I give up my job and my apartment and my entire life to follow you around?" And he flinched like she'd hit him and said, "Yes, I'm sorry." And she hated that he kept apologizing because apologies didn't fix this, didn't unmark her or uncomplicate her life, but they did make it harder to hate him completely. At 3:40, Vasily Crane arrived, and Maya knew he was dangerous before he even spoke, knew it in the way Konstantin's posture changed, shoulders back and jaw tight, knew it in the sudden drop in temperature, like the brownstone itself was reacting to his presence. Vasily was tall and sharp-suited, charcoal gray that probably cost more than Maya made in 6 months, and he moved through the door without knocking, without hesitation, like he owned every space he entered, and his eyes when they landed on Maya were clinical, assessing, the look a scientist gives a specimen under glass. He said, "Maya Torres, 28, night shift janitor at St. Agnes, no family, no close friends, minimal digital footprint. You're either very private or very lonely." And Maya felt her hands curl into fists, because how dare he recite her life like it was a case file? How dare he reduce her to statistics and isolation? But before she could speak, he turned to Constantine and said, "The council convenes at dawn. You will answer for your desertion, and she will be assessed for binding or release." And Constantine's jaw went tighter, muscle jumping near his ear, and Vasily continued, "You haven't attended council in 36 years, Constantine. They're not going to be merciful just because you finally decided to stop hiding," and the way he said hiding made it sound like cowardice, made it sound like failure. Constantine stood slowly, carefully, like his ribs were reminding him they were still broken, and said in that gravel voice that seemed to cost him, "She will not be bound. I will invoke the trial of witness if the council demands it." And Vasily's eyebrows rose fractionally, the first crack in his professional mask, and he said, "The trial hasn't been invoked in 2 centuries. Are you sure you want to expose her to that kind of scrutiny?" And Constantine said simply, "Yes." Vasily's eyes flicked back to Maya, and for half a second, maybe less, something almost like pity crossed his face, softened the clinical assessment into something human, and then it was gone, and he was all business again, pulling a card from his jacket pocket and setting it on the table between old maps and coffee rings. He said, "If you run, Miss Torres, I'm required to retrieve you. It's my job as council enforcer, but I'd rather not." And the words were professional, but the tone underneath was almost gentle, almost regretful, and Maya grabbed the card and said, "Is that supposed to make me feel better? Knowing you'll hunt me politely?" And Vasily almost smiled, corner of his mouth twitching, and said, "No. It's supposed to make you understand that the system doesn't care about your feelings or your choices. It cares about control. And if you're smart, you'll let Constantine bind you and disappear into his protection, become invisible again." And Maya said, "I've been invisible for 6 years. I'm done with that." And something shifted in Vasily's expression, respect maybe, or recognition, like he was seeing her properly for the first time. He moved toward the door and paused, looked back at Constantine and said, "The council doesn't forgive desertion. They'll make an example of you if they can." And then his eyes cut to Maya and he added, "And they'll make her the price you pay for coming back." And then he was gone, door closing soft behind him, and the temperature slowly climbed back to normal, but the cold he'd brought stayed in Maya's bones. She looked at Constantine and said, "What's binding, really? Not the legal definition, but what does it do?" And he met her eyes and she saw shame there, old and deep, and he said, "Dr. Patel, the one who treated me, he's bound. He was human once, chose to tie himself to a vampire physician in exchange for protection, and now he can't leave, can't refuse orders, can't even think about running because the bond won't let him. It's autonomy traded for safety, except it's not really safety. It's just a prettier cage." And Maya thought about Dr. Patel's pale face, the way he'd moved with mechanical efficiency, and felt sick. Constantine continued, "I won't do that to you. I won't erase you to save you, which is why I'll invoke the trial. You'll testify publicly about why you saved me, and if the council believes you're telling the truth, they'll grant protection without binding. But if they think you're lying, or if your testimony destabilizes the political situation, they can declare you fair game and any vampire can claim or kill you." And Maya absorbed this, turned it over in her mind and said, "So either I get erased through binding, or I gamble my life on whether 13 vampire lords believe I'm honest." And Constantine said, "Yes, I'm sorry." And Maya laughed again, that same bitter, sharp sound, and said, "Stop apologizing and teach me how to survive this." They sat at the table as the sky outside shifted from black to gray, pre-dawn light creeping through shutters, and he taught her vampire law in halting sentences, the rules and loopholes and ancient doctrines that governed a world she'd never known existed, and she watched his hands as he gestured at maps, scarred knuckles and careful fingers that never once reached for her without permission. And she thought, "He's dangerous, but he's not cruel. He's powerful, but he's breaking himself open to keep me alive." And that was more terrifying than the vampires in Scrubs or Vasily's clinical assessment, because it meant she was starting to trust him, starting to care what happened to him, and caring had always been the thing that got her hurt. Dawn broke cold and gray over Philadelphia, and Maya followed Constantine down stone steps beneath Reading Terminal Market into a world that smelled like metal and old incense, into council chambers that shouldn't exist under a place where tourists bought cheesesteaks and Amish pretzels, and the contrast made her head spin, made her feel like she'd stepped through a membrane between the ordinary city she knew and something ancient that had been waiting beneath it all along. The underground hall stretched vast and vaulted, stone ceiling carved with symbols she didn't recognize, chandeliers dripping crystal that caught the light and threw it back in sharp angles. And at the far end, 13 obsidian thrones arranged in a crescent. 13 vampire lords, sitting motionless as statues, watching her with eyes that ranged from gold to silver to red. And Maya felt the weight of their attention like physical pressure against her skin. Constantine's hand hovered near her elbow, not touching but close, and his breathing was shallow, careful, like each inhale cost him. And she realized he was terrified, This vampire king, who'd lived 8 centuries, was afraid of these 13 people, and that should have made her feel worse. But somehow, it steadied her, because at least she wasn't alone in her fear. The session was public. Vampire law apparently required transparency for royal resurrections, and the gallery behind them held maybe 40 vampires, all silent, all watching, and Maya squared her shoulders and lifted her chin because she'd spent 6 years invisible, and if she was going to be seen, really seen, she wouldn't let them watch her crumble. The vampire in the center throne rose, and Maya's first thought was porcelain doll. Delicate features and pale skin that looked like it would crack if you touched it wrong. But then the woman spoke and her voice was silk sliding over. Knives, beautiful and deadly, and she said, Maya Torres, you stand witness to the return of Konstantin Drayev, last king of the Eastern bloodlines, and by the doctrine of witnessed return you must choose, submit to binding or face dissolution, and Maya's mouth went dry because dissolution sounded like a polite word for murder. Constantine stepped forward, and his voice came out rough, but stronger than it had been in the brownstone, loud enough to carry, and he said, I invoke the trial of witness. She will testify freely. And the porcelain woman, Isadora Vex, according to the placard on her throne, smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Maya think of cats with cornered mice. And Isadora said, The trial of witness, how delightfully archaic, I accept. But let me remind you of the conditions from the Statute of Verity. If this girl testifies, and we deem her words false or politically destabilizing, she forfeits all protection and becomes fair game. Any vampire may claim or kill her as they see fit. Do you accept these terms? Maya felt Constantine go rigid beside her, felt the air in the chamber shift like everyone had stopped breathing, and she wanted to grab his arm and tell him no, don't do this, don't gamble my life on whether these 13 predators decide to believe me. But before she could speak, he said, Yes, I accept, and his voice cracked on the second word, like it hurt him to say it. Isadora's smile widened, and she settled back onto her throne, crossing legs that were probably older than the Declaration of Independence, and said, Then let us begin, Maya Torres. Tell us why you saved a creature you did not know, why you risked yourself for someone the world declared dead. And Maya swallowed hard and said, Because he was dying and I'm a janitor, I clean up messes, I make things better when I can, and leaving him to bleed out in the rain would have been, she paused, searching for words, would have been erasing part of myself, the part that still believes kindness matters even when the world punishes you for it. The chamber was so quiet she could hear the crystal chandeliers trembling, could hear her own heartbeat hammering against her ribs, and one of the other council members, a man with silver eyes and a scar bisecting his face, leaned forward and said, Kindness is a human luxury, girl. In our world it is a weakness that gets exploited, and Maya felt anger flare hot in her chest and said, Then your world is broken, and the chamber erupted in whispers, hissing sibilant sounds that echoed off stone, and Isadora raised one hand and silence fell like a guillotine blade. Isadora's eyes fixed on Maya and she said, Broken, perhaps, but it is the world you now inhabit, and binding is mercy. Girl, autonomy in our world is just a slower death. We would tie your will to Constantine's protection, and you would be safe, invisible again. Isn't that what you want? And Maya thought about Dr. Patel's mechanical movements, thought about 6 years of being invisible and hating it, and said, No, I don't want to be erased. I want to survive as myself, or not at all. Constantine's hand found her wrist, fingers wrapping careful around bone, and she felt him trembling, felt the weight of what she'd just said settling over both of them, and Isadora laughed, bright and terrible, and said, So brave, so foolish, very well. The council will vote on whether your testimony is true and whether it serves the realm. But know this, Maya Torres, if even one of us deems you false or destabilizing, You become prey. Do you understand? And Maya said, yes, because what else could she say? Because she'd already chosen this path when she dragged Constantine through the service entrance, and there was no going back now. The vote happened in silence, each council member raising a hand or leaving it lowered, and Maya counted 6 hands up, 5 down, 2 abstaining, and her stomach dropped because 6 wasn't enough, wasn't majority. But then one of the abstaining vampires, a woman with gold eyes like Constantine's, said, I change my vote to affirm, her testimony rings true, and that made 7, and Maya's knees almost buckled with relief, except Isadora was still smiling, and that meant the trap hadn't sprung yet. Isadora said, 7 affirm her truth, but we must also vote on whether her testimony destabilizes the realm, whether her presence disrupts the peace we have maintained these 36 years. All in favor of declaring her disruptive raise your hand, and 9 hands went up, 9 out of 13, and Isadora's smile turned triumphant and she said, the girl's testimony is true but disruptive, therefore she is granted protection under Constantine's name with one condition, for 48 hours she remains fair game, a grace period for any vampire to challenge Constantine's claim by capturing her. If he can defend her through that period, the protection becomes permanent. If not, well, the matter resolves itself. Maya felt the floor tilt under her feet, felt Constantine's grip on her wrist tighten until bones ground together, and she heard him inhale sharp and ragged, and then his voice rang out louder than she'd ever heard it, loud enough to make the chandeliers shake. She testifies under my name. If you touch her, you invoke blood war with the Drave line. And the chamber went absolutely still, frozen like someone had stopped time, and Isadora's smile sharpened into something savage and delighted, and she said, then you accept the throne, Constantine. You cannot invoke Drave law as a dead man. You cannot claim the protection of a royal bloodline you abandoned. Choose now. Reclaim your crown, or watch her become prey. Maya watched Constantine's face and saw 36 years of running collide with this single moment, saw the weight of every person who'd died because of him crash against the weight of letting her die because he was too afraid to claim what he'd been, and his jaw tightened, and his gold eyes met Isadora's across the chamber, and he said, I accept, and the chandeliers flared bright gold, ancient magic recognizing the claim, recognizing that the dead king was dead no longer, and the council erupted in whispers and movement, vampires standing and sitting and turning to each other, and Maya stood in the center of it all with Constantine's hand still wrapped around her wrist and thought, he just sacrificed everything for me. He just painted a target on himself that every vampire who wanted him dead in 89 can see. And she didn't know if she should thank him or scream at him for making that choice without asking her. She leaned close, close enough that only he could hear over the chaos, and whispered, you just painted a target on yourself for me. And he turned to look at her, and his eyes were exhausted and determined, and something else she couldn't name. And he whispered back, I painted it 36 years ago when I walked away. You're just the first person worth coming back for. And Maya's heart did something complicated in her chest, something that felt like falling and catching herself at the same time. Isadora stood and raised both hands, and the chamber quieted, and she said, so be it. Constantine Driev reclaims the throne of the Eastern bloodlines, and Maya Torres is granted protection under his name, with the fair game clause active for 48 hours beginning now. This session is adjourned, and the vampires in the gallery began to file out, some watching Maya with hunger, some watching Constantine with calculation. And Maya thought, 48 hours, I have to survive 48 hours of being hunted. And Constantine's hand was still on her wrist, steady and warm, and she realized she was noticing things she shouldn't. The way his jaw tightened when Isadora spoke, the way his thumb rested against her pulse point like he was counting her heartbeats, the way he stood between her and the council like a shield made of bone and desperation. They walked out of the council chambers together, climbing stone steps back into the ordinary world of Reading Terminal Market, where early vendors were setting up fruit stands and coffee carts, and the contrast was dizzying. Supernatural politics and tourist breakfasts existing in the same space, and Maya's legs felt shaky, adrenaline draining away and leaving her hollow. Constantine kept his hand on her elbow, guiding her through the crowd, and she let him because her brain was still processing what had just happened, still turning over the fact that he'd reclaimed a throne he'd spent decades hiding from just to keep her alive. And she didn't know what to do with that information, didn't know how to hold the weight of being worth that much to someone. They made it to the brownstone as full dawn broke, October sunlight slanting through shutters, and Constantine locked the door behind them and leaned against it like standing was taking everything he had left, and Maya said, "Why did you do that? Why did you accept the throne for me? You could have let me take my chances with the fair game clause." And he looked at her with those gold eyes that had seen centuries she couldn't imagine and said, "Because I've spent 36 years watching people suffer for my cowardice, watching the council twist vampire law into a surveillance state because I was too afraid to fight them, and you saved me without knowing who I was, without expecting anything. You saw a dying man, and you chose kindness, and I will not let them punish you for being the kind of person I forgot existed." Maya felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously because she would not cry, would not break down when she needed to stay sharp and survive the next 48 hours. But something in her chest was cracking open. Some wall she'd built around herself to survive 6 years of loneliness. And she said, "I'm not special. I'm just a janitor who made a choice." And Constantine pushed off the door and crossed to her and cupped her face in scarred hands and said, "You're the first person in decades who made me want to stop running, who made me remember what I was supposed to be protecting when I took the throne the first time. And that makes you the most dangerous thing that's ever happened to me." His hands were warm against her skin, and she could feel his pulse in his fingertips, and she realized with the jolt that went through her like electricity that she wanted him to kiss her, wanted it even though they were being hunted, even though the next 48 hours were a countdown to violence, wanted it because, or maybe in spite of the fact that he'd just upended his entire existence to keep her alive, and the wanting scared her more than Isadora's smile or Vasili's clinical assessment, or the knowledge that somewhere in the city vampires were already planning how to capture her and force Constantine to fight. He seemed to read something in her face, because his thumb brushed her cheekbone, and his eyes went soft, and he said, "Not yet. Not while you're still in danger. I won't take anything from you that isn't freely given when you're safe." And Maya wanted to tell him she was giving it freely now, but the words stuck in her throat, and instead, she just nodded and stepped back, and his hands fell away, and the space between them felt like a promise and a threat, and the beginning of something neither of them knew how to name. The brownstones settled around them, dust and old maps, and the faint smell of blood, and somewhere in the city the 48-hour clock was ticking down, and Maya thought, "I matter to him. I matter enough that he reclaimed a throne, and maybe that's worth fighting for. Maybe that's worth surviving for," and she caught herself staring at his hands again, at the careful way he moved through space, like he was afraid of breaking things. And she thought, "I'm in so much trouble. Not just from the vampires hunting me, but from the way my heart keeps reaching toward him even when my brain knows better." Maya stood in the council chambers at 8:30 in the morning, with daylight filtering through high windows and turning the cold marble floors into mirrors, and every word she spoke echoed like a gavel strike, like a verdict being passed on her own life. And she told the truth because lying seemed pointless, when 13 vampires could probably hear her heartbeat change if she tried to deceive them. She said, "I saved him because he was dying, not because I knew who he was or what saving him would mean. I heard him gasping outside the service entrance, and I dragged him inside because leaving someone to bleed out in the rain felt like erasing part of myself, the part that still believes people matter even when the world punishes you for caring." And he whispered, "Stay, and I stayed, because that word sounded less like an order and more like the first honest thing anyone had said to me in 6 years. The council listened in silence, so complete she could hear her own breathing, could hear the rustle of fabric when one of the vampires shifted in their obsidian throne, and Isadora Vex leaned forward with those porcelain features arranged in something that might have been curiosity or might have been contempt, and said, "Do you understand that your kindness has destabilized a peace 36 years in the making? That your choice to save one vampire has put hundreds of lives at risk?" And Maya felt anger flare hot in her chest, felt 6 years of being invisible and overlooked rise up through her throat, and she said, "If your peace requires pretending kind people don't exist, it wasn't peace, it was a ceasefire. It was everyone agreeing to look away from cruelty and call it stability." The chamber held its breath, and Maya saw 3 council members nod slightly, saw something that might have been approval or might have been respect flicker across their ancient faces, and Isadora's smile vanished like someone had wiped it away with a cloth. And she said coldly, "The council will vote." And Maya watched hands rise and fall, watched her fate decided by creatures who'd lived centuries and still apparently hadn't learned that autonomy mattered more than control. The verdict came swift and brutal. Maya's testimony was deemed true but disruptive. She was granted protection under Constantine's name, but the fair game clause remained active for 48 hours, a grace period for any vampire to challenge Constantine's claim by capturing her. And Constantine's hand found hers under the table, fingers lacing through fingers. And he didn't let go even when Isadora's eyes tracked the movement and her smile returned sharp as broken glass. They retreated to the brownstone at 3 in the afternoon, and the October sun slanted through cracked shutters, turning dust motes into constellations, and Constantine sat across from her at the table covered in maps and old coffee rings, and taught her vampire law, not to scare her but to arm her, speaking in that rough voice that still sounded like it cost him everything to use. He explained that the fair game clause was a trap, that Isadora expected challengers and each one would force him to fight publicly, exhausting him while she consolidated power behind the scenes. And Maya watched him trace routes on a map of Philadelphia, watched his scarred knuckles move across paper, and asked the question that had been building in her chest since the council chambers. Why did you fake your death? What happened in '89 that made hiding seem better than fighting? Constantine was silent for a long moment, silent enough that Maya thought he wouldn't answer. And then he said, "I discovered the council was binding humans en masse, hundreds of people every year, erasing their autonomy to create a servant class, and I tried to stop it, called an emergency session, presented evidence, demanded immediate reform, and Isadora and 6 other council members tried to assassinate me 3 days later." His voice went quieter, rawer, and he continued, "They ambushed me in my own estate, used poison that shouldn't have worked on someone my age, but did because they'd been planning it for months, and I barely escaped. And I was so tired, Maya, so tired of fighting people who were supposed to be allies. So I faked my death and went silent and told myself my absence would force them to change. That without me to oppose, they'd have no choice but to reform the system." He looked up and met her eyes, and she saw centuries of failure written in his face, and he said, "Instead, I just made it easier for them to do worse. The binding program expanded. They turned vampire law into a surveillance state, and I've carried that failure for 36 years, carried the weight of every person who got bound, because I was too much of a coward to keep fighting." Maya reached across the table and touched his scarred knuckles, felt the raised tissue under her fingertips, and said, "You're awake now. That's what matters. You can't fix the past, but you can fight for the future." And for the first time since 1989, Constantine allowed himself to hope that maybe he could repair what he'd broken, that maybe this woman who'd saved him without asking for anything could help him become the king he'd failed to be. The sun set, and the brownstone filled with shadows, and at 11 that night, Maya was trying to sleep on the couch under Constantine's coat, when she heard footsteps on the roof, fast and light. And Constantine was moving before she could sit up, was pulling her to her feet, and pushing her toward the corner and saying, "Stay here. Don't come out no matter what you hear." And then he was gone, climbing the fire escape to the roof, and Maya lasted maybe 30 seconds before terror and stubborn defiance drove her to the doorway where she could see. The rooftop was bathed in moonlight, half hidden by clouds, and Constantine faced another vampire, tall and broad-shouldered, with a smile that showed too many teeth, and, the stranger said, Gregor of the Western bloodlines claims this witness by ancient right of pursuit and capture. Yield her and avoid bloodshed, Drev. And Constantine said nothing, just moved, and the fight was fast and brutal, and nothing like the choreographed violence Maya had seen in movies. They collided like freight trains, no weapons, just fists and speed that made Maya's eyes water trying to track, and Constantine was still injured, still healing from the wounds that had nearly killed him 2 days ago, and Gregor was fresh and strong and laughing as he landed blows that drove Constantine back toward the roof edge. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs, and she gripped the doorframe hard enough to hurt, and watched Constantine take a hit that should have dropped him, watched him stagger and catch himself, and she thought, he's losing, he's going to lose, and Gregor will take me, and Constantine will have reclaimed the throne for nothing. And then Gregor's eyes cut to her, hungry and calculating, and he lunged past Constantine straight for the doorway. Constantine's rage ignited like gasoline meeting a match, and he moved faster than Maya's eyes could track, was suddenly between her and Gregor with his hand locked around Gregor's throat, and he slammed the other vampire down onto concrete hard enough to crack it, and growled in a voice that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "She is not a prize. Touch her again, and I'll make you beg for the sun." And Gregor went limp immediately, yielding with both hands raised, and Constantine held him there for 3 more seconds, like he was considering killing him anyway, before letting go and stepping back. Maya sagged against the doorframe, legs shaking, and watched Gregor scramble to his feet and vault over the roof edge, disappearing into the city, and then Constantine turned to her and his eyes were still gold-bright with fury and fear, and something else she couldn't name, and he crossed to her in 3 strides and cupped her face in his hands, checking for injuries, and she said, "I'm fine. You won." And he said, "You shouldn't have watched, you shouldn't have seen that," and she said, "I needed to see it, needed to know what you're risking for me." Their eyes locked, and the space between them felt charged like the air before a thunderstorm, and Maya saw him lean in, saw his gaze drop to her mouth, and her breath caught because yes, she wanted this, wanted him, wanted to feel something besides fear and exhaustion, but he pulled back at the last second, pulled back and rested his forehead against hers and murmured, "Not like this. Not when you're still in danger. I won't take anything from you that isn't freely given when you're safe." And Maya's heart cracked open, because how was she supposed to protect herself from falling for someone who fought like that, who held her like she was breakable and precious and worth reclaiming a throne for? A voice from the adjacent rooftop said, "Touching, really?" And they jerked apart to find Vasily Crane standing in silhouette against the city lights, and he vaulted the gap between buildings with inhuman grace and landed soft as a cat on their roof. He said, "Council-mandated witness, I'm required to record all fair game challenges. Congratulations on your victory, Constantine. 1 down and 2 to go," and Maya felt her stomach drop because 2 more fights like that, and Constantine was already bleeding from a split lip, already moving like his ribs hurt. And Vasily continued, "2 more challengers are coming. He can't fight them all, not in his condition, unless—" And he trailed off and Maya demanded, "Unless what? Finish it." And Vasily's eyes met hers, and she saw something almost like respect there, and he said, "Unless you bind to him willingly, it voids the fair game clause immediately. You'd be safe, and he wouldn't have to fight anymore." Maya felt Constantine go rigid beside her, felt his hand find hers and squeeze once in warning or plea or both, and she said, "No, I'm not trading my autonomy for safety. I'm not becoming another Dr. Patel." And Vasily nodded slowly, and something that might have been approval crossed his face, and he said, "Good. I was testing whether you'd cave, whether you'd choose the easy way out." And Maya said, "There's nothing easy about any of this." And Vasily almost smiled and said, "No, there isn't. Which is why most people choose binding. They choose the cage because at least cages are predictable." He pulled something from his jacket pocket, a burner phone cheap and anonymous, and tossed it to Maya, and she caught it on instinct, and he said, "When the council turns on you, and they will, call me," and then he was gone, vaulting back to the adjacent roof and disappearing into shadow, and Maya stood there with the phone heavy in her hand and Konstantin's blood on the concrete and thought, "He's defecting." Or thinking about it, "The enforcer who's supposed to hunt me just gave me a lifeline." Constantine swayed, and Maya caught his elbow and guided him back down the fire escape into the brownstone, into lamplight and dust and the smell of old books, and she made him sit on the couch while she found the first aid kit, ancient and barely stocked but good enough to clean the split lip and check his ribs. She knelt in front of him and pressed careful fingers to his side, and he hissed, but didn't pull away, and she said, "You can't keep doing this. 2 more fights will kill you." And he said, "I'll survive. I've survived worse." And she said, "That's not the same as living. Surviving isn't enough." And he caught her wrist gently and said, "It is if it means you're alive at the end of it." Maya felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously because she would not cry, would not break down when he needed her steady, but something in her chest was fracturing, some wall between her heart and her brain, and she said, "I'm not worth dying for. I'm just a janitor who made a choice." And Constantine pulled her closer, pulled her up onto the couch beside him, and said, "You're the person who made me want to stop running. Who made me remember what I was supposed to be protecting when I took the throne 8 centuries ago. And if that's not worth fighting for, then nothing is." His hand was still on her wrist, thumb resting against her pulse point, and Maya thought about the almost kiss on the rooftop, thought about the way he'd moved between her and Gregor without hesitation, thought about the fact that she was falling for him in the worst possible moment. Falling for a vampire king who'd been silent for 36 years and was learning to speak again because of her. And the wanting was terrifying because wanting meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain, and she'd spent 6 years building walls specifically to avoid this feeling. But the walls were rubble now, demolished by a man who looked at her like she mattered more than empires, and Maya leaned her head against his shoulder and felt his arm come around her careful and warm, and she said, 2 more fights, 48 hours isn't even half over," and he said, "I know, but I'm not facing them alone anymore. I have you, and that's more than I've had in decades." And Maya closed her eyes and let herself have this moment, this brief island of safety in a sea of violence, and thought, "I'm in so much trouble, not just from the vampires hunting me, but from the way my heart keeps choosing him, even when logic says run." Maya had just started to believe they might survive the night when the second challenger arrived at 12:45, and this time he didn't bother with formalities or ancient rites, just came through the brownstone door with a council warrant in one hand and murder in his eyes, and he said in a voice smooth as poisoned honey, "Konstantin Dryev, your resurrection violates the statute of finality. A dead king cannot reclaim the throne without majority council approval, which you do not have. Therefore, this warrant voids your protection of the witness Maya Torres effective immediately." Constantine went very still in the way Maya had learned meant he was calculating odds and outcomes, and he said, "Isadora sent you, didn't she? This is her end game." And the lieutenant smiled, showing fangs, and said, "The head of council merely enforces the law, and besides, you've destabilized the realm with your return. 2 fights in 12 hours. How long before your presence sparks a civil war?" And Constantine said, "She engineered this. The fair game clause was bait to force me into fights, then use those fights as evidence I'm dangerous." And the lieutenant's smile widened and he said, "Clever for a king who's been dead so long. But it doesn't matter. Isadora's already moving. The council votes at dawn to strip your claim. The girl becomes fair game permanently unless you yield the throne." And then he lunged not for Constantine, but for Maya. She saw him coming and grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, some instinct older than thought driving her hands, and she swung hard at his knee, felt the impact jar through her arms, and he stumbled just enough for Constantine to intercept, to slam into him with force that cracked the floorboards. They fought fast and brutal, and Constantine was weakening. Maya could see it in the way he moved half a second slower than before, could see blood seeping through the bandages on his ribs, and she thought, 2 fights in 12 hours is killing him. He can't keep doing this. But he fought anyway. Fought like her life depended on it, which it did. And he got the lieutenant pinned against the wall with one hand around his throat. And the lieutenant wheezed out, "You're already losing, Dreyev. Yield the throne and she lives. Keep fighting and you both burn." And Constantine froze, just for a second. And that second was enough for the lieutenant to twist free and vault through the window, glass shattering, disappearing into the October night. Constantine stood in the wreckage, breathing hard and bleeding, and Maya crossed to him and pressed her hand to his ribs where fresh blood darkened his shirt, and she said, "We need to leave. If Isadora is moving the council against you, then this place isn't safe." And he nodded but didn't move, just stared at the broken window, like he could see the future rushing toward them through the gap. They fled to the Bellevue Hotel rooftop at 2 in the morning, high and public, and harder to attack without witnesses, and the October wind cut through Maya's borrowed coat, cut straight to bone, and below them the city was waking, delivery trucks and early commuters, and a world that had no idea monsters lived in the spaces between streetlights. Constantine leaned against the roof access door, and Maya watched him unravel in real time, watched 36 years of running crash against this moment where running was no longer an option, and he said, "You should go. Disappear into the city. I'll fight Isadora alone. I reclaimed the throne to protect you, but the throne is the weapon she's using against you, and I don't know how to fix this." Maya felt fury ignite in her chest, fury at him for trying to make her choices, fury at herself for caring so much it hurt, and she crossed the distance between them and grabbed his face in both hands and forced him to look at her. Really look at her, and she said, "You didn't drag me into this. I walked in. I chose to save you, and I chose to stay, and I'm choosing now to fight beside you, so stop trying to protect me from my own decisions and let me help you." Constantine's gold eyes were wet, and he said, "I've been alone so long. I forgot what it felt like to have someone choose me. Not the throne, or the power, or the political advantage. Just me." And Maya said, "I'm choosing you, the man who went silent because he was tired of people dying, the man who's learning to speak again because he thinks I'm worth it, and I'm not leaving you to fight ghosts alone." He broke then, silent tears tracking down his face, decades of exhaustion and failure and loneliness pouring out, and Maya pulled him close and held him while he shook, held him the way she'd wanted someone to hold her through 6 years of invisibility and night shifts, and believing she didn't matter to anyone. And it wasn't romantic, wasn't soft or gentle. It was 2 people who'd been alone too long finally being seen by someone who understood that survival wasn't the same as living. The sky was shifting from black to gray, pre-dawn light creeping over the city, when Vasily Crane arrived on the rooftop, and Maya tensed expecting another fight. But Vasily raised both hands empty and said, "I'm not here to enforce, I'm here to defect." And Constantine lifted his head from Maya's shoulder, eyes red and wary, and said, "Why? What changed?" And Vasily said, "I've been watching her for 2 days, watching her refuse to bind when it would have saved her, watching her testify knowing the council would punish honesty, watching her choose danger over safety because she believes people matter more than systems. And I realized I've spent 300 years enforcing laws I thought were just, laws I thought protected people, and somewhere along the way, those laws became chains, and I became the one locking them." He pulled a folder from inside his jacket, old leather cracked and stained, and handed it to Constantine, and he said, "Evidence of Isadora's embezzlement from the Dreyev vaults, 30 years of documented transfers, falsified records. She's been siphoning resources since you disappeared, used your absence to legitimize her control, and she needs you reinstated as king so she can continue accessing the vaults. But she also needs you controllable or dead. That's why she engineered the fair game clause, exhaust you with fights, then strip your claim and eliminate the witness. Maya watched Constantine open the folder, watched his face go hard as he read, and Vasily continued, "With this you can challenge her publicly at the dawn vote, turn the council against her, but she'll have every loyal vampire in the city ready to kill you if you try. This isn't just politics anymore, it's war, and you need to decide if you're willing to burn the system down to save one human." Constantine looked at Maya, and she saw the question in his eyes, saw him weighing her life against centuries of tradition and vampire law, and she said, "Burn it, burn all of it. Any system that punishes kindness deserves to fall." And Constantine's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile but was close, and he turned to Vasily and said, "I accept your defection." And Vasily knelt, formal and ancient, and said, "I pledge my service to the Dreyev line, not to enforce its laws, but to help dismantle the ones that turn protection into prison." And Constantine touched his shoulder in acceptance, and Maya watched the blood oath seal between them, watched Vasily's eyes flare gold, then settle, and thought, "The system is cracking, because I refuse to disappear, because I chose to matter." They sat on the rooftop as dawn approached, three people planning to walk into a council chamber and accuse the head of centuries of corruption, and Constantine laid out the strategy. He would present the evidence publicly, force a vote on Isidora's removal, and Maya would stand beside him as living proof that the system punished compassion, that vampire law had become a tool for control instead of protection. Vasily added that the council would fracture. Some would side with Isidora because they benefited from her corruption. Others would side with Constantine because the evidence was damning. And the ones in the middle would vote based on fear, not principle. And if they failed, if the council sided with Isidora, then Maya and Constantine would both be declared fair game permanently, and civil war would become inevitable. Maya absorbed this, turned it over in her mind, and said, "So we're gambling everything on whether 13 ancient vampires care more about justice than power." And Constantine said, "Yes, I'm sorry." And Maya said, "Stop apologizing. I'm tired of hearing you apologize for giving me choices." And Vasily said quietly, "Most people don't want choices, they want safety, which is why the council has maintained power so long. They offer the illusion of protection in exchange for autonomy, and most people take that deal." Constantine turned to Maya, and his voice was rough and raw, and he said, "You can still walk away, disappear before dawn. I'll fight this alone. I won't blame you for choosing survival." And Maya felt something fierce and bright burn in her chest, and she said, "I'm not leaving, not because you need me, because I need to see this through. I need to know that choosing kindness over invisibility was worth it, that saving you that night meant something bigger than just one life." Constantine's hand found hers, and he laced their fingers together and pulled her close enough that she could feel his breath against her forehead. And he said, "If we survive this, if we somehow make it through the dawn vote and Isidora's retaliation and whatever comes after, I'll ask you properly. Not as a king asking a witness, just as a man who's tired of being alone asking a woman who taught him how to speak again." And Maya said, "Ask me now. I don't want to wait for safety that might never come. I want to hear it now, while we're still alive to mean it." Constantine's voice broke when he said, "Stay with me, not because of law or debt or protection, not because you're marked or hunted or caught in vampire politics, but because you want to, because you choose me the way I'm choosing you." And Maya said, "I already am. I've been choosing you since the moment you said stay in that hospital corridor. I just didn't have words for it yet." He kissed her forehead, gentle and aching, lips pressing against skin like a promise or a prayer, and Maya closed her eyes and felt tears slip free, because this wasn't how she'd imagined falling in love, not surrounded by violence and political machinations and the countdown to a confrontation that could kill them both, but maybe love was always like this, messy and terrifying and worth fighting for anyway. Vasily cleared his throat and said, "Dawn in 45 minutes, we should prepare." And the moment broke, but didn't shatter, just transformed into something harder and more determined. And Maya stood with Constantine's hand still in hers and looked out over the city, waking below them, and thought, I'm about to walk into a council chamber and testify against the most powerful vampire in Philadelphia. I'm about to watch the man I love accuse his enemy of crimes that will spark a war. And I'm terrified. But I'm also more alive than I've been in 6 years because finally I matter to someone, and they matter to me, and that's worth burning the whole system down to protect. Constantine pulled her close one more time, wrapped his arms around her like he could shield her from what was coming, and he said, "Thank you for saving me. Not just that night in the hospital, but every moment since. Thank you for refusing to let me hide." And Maya pressed her face into his shoulder and said, "Thank you for asking me to stay, for giving me a reason to stop being invisible." And they stood there on the rooftop with Vasily keeping watch, and the sky turning from gray to pale gold, and the city spreading out beneath them like a battlefield waiting for the first shot. And Maya thought, this is it. This is the moment everything changes. And I'm ready. I'm finally ready to be seen. Maya walked into the council chambers at 5:45 in the morning, with the sunrise bleeding orange light through high windows and turning cold marble into something almost warm. And she felt every eye track her movement as she crossed to stand beside Constantine, felt the weight of 13 vampire lords assessing whether she was catalyst or victim, or something they hadn't anticipated. Isadora Vex sat in the center throne, looking confident and untouchable, porcelain features arranged in a smile that said she'd already won. And Constantine stepped forward with the evidence folder in his hands, and his voice rang out clear and strong, no longer halting or rough, but the voice of a king who'd remembered how to rule. And he said, I present evidence of 30 years of embezzlement, documented transfers from Drea vaults to Isadora Vex's private accounts, falsified records claiming these resources funded the binding program, when in fact the program expanded while she siphoned wealth for personal gain. And she did this while claiming it was my legacy, my failure, when I was the one who tried to stop it. The chamber erupted in whispers and movement, 3 council members immediately standing to call for Isadora's arrest. But 4 others rose with hands on weapons, loyalists who'd benefited from her corruption or feared her retaliation, and the room split down the middle like a fault line, cracking open. Isadora laughed, bright and terrible, and said, You think evidence matters, Constantine. I've kept this realm stable for 30 years while you hid like a coward. I've maintained order and prevented chaos. And yes, I took resources, but I earned them by doing the work you abandoned. And Constantine said, You didn't maintain order. You built a prison. You turned vampire law into a surveillance state and erased human autonomy to create a servant class. And he gestured to Maya. And I abandoned a system built on erasing people like her, people who save lives without asking for anything in return. And you've built an empire on making sure no one can choose freely, on making sure kindness is punished and control is rewarded. His voice got louder, more certain, and he said, I'm not reclaiming the throne to rule. I'm reclaiming it to tear down every law that made hiding seem like the only option. Every statute that turns protection into chains, and if that destabilizes your precious peace, then your peace was never worth keeping. The chamber split 6-6 with 1 abstention, a perfect stalemate. And Maya watched Isadora's smile sharpen into something predatory, and she drew a blade from somewhere in her robes, silver and ancient, and said, Then we settle this the old way, you and me, Constantine. Winner takes the throne and the girl. And Constantine stepped forward, already reaching for a weapon he didn't have. But Maya's brain was racing because there had to be another way. Had to be some loophole or technicality. And she remembered Vasily on the rooftop teaching her obscure laws while they waited for dawn. Remembered him saying, if a witness's testimony causes a council split, the witness may invoke the right of the catalyst. It's never been used in modern times, but it's still valid. And Maya's voice cut through the chamber before Constantine could respond to Isadora's challenge, and she said, I invoke the right of the catalyst, My testimony caused this split, therefore I call for public referendum. Let every vampire in this city vote on whether the binding program continues or ends. Let them decide if the system you've built serves them or enslaves them." Silence fell like a physical weight, and Isadora's blade lowered fractionally, and she said, "That law hasn't been invoked in 2 centuries. It's a relic." And Maya said, "But it's still on the books. You can't challenge it without admitting the law you've spent decades enforcing is invalid." And Isadora's face went cold and furious, because Maya had her trapped, had used vampire law against itself the way Constantine had taught her. Vasily moved first, crossing the chamber to kneel in front of Maya, formal and deliberate, acknowledging her authority as catalyst. And Maya's heart hammered because this was it. This was the moment the system either broke or adapted, and one by one 4 of the 6 lords who'd sided with Constantine knelt. Then the abstaining lord knelt, and the chamber was half kneeling, half standing, a realm visibly divided, and Isadora hissed, "This isn't over. You think a referendum will save you, but I have loyalists in every district. I'll see you burn before I let a human dismantle what I built." And then she was gone. Smoke and old magic, vanishing like she'd never been there at all. Constantine turned to Maya with gold eyes wide, and something like awe written across his face, and he said, "You just ended a dynasty with a technicality." And Maya's hands were shaking, adrenaline draining away and leaving her hollow. And she said, "I learned from the best. You taught me that vampire law has loopholes big enough to drive a revolution through." And Constantine laughed, actual laughter that sounded rusty and surprised. And he pulled her close and pressed his forehead to hers and said, "You're terrifying, you know that, absolutely terrifying in the best possible way." The council adjourned with instructions to organize the referendum within 3 days, and in the interim Constantine's claim stood, and Maya remained under his protection, but Isadora was in the wind gathering loyalists, and everyone knew the real fight was just beginning. But for now, for this moment, they'd won something, had fractured the system enough to let light in. They walked out of the council chambers into October dawn, and the city was waking around them. Delivery trucks rumbling past and early commuters clutching coffee cups and pigeons, pecking at the pavement. Normal, ordinary life, continuing completely unaware of the war brewing beneath it. And the contrast made Maya dizzy, made her feel like she existed in 2 worlds simultaneously. The supernatural one, where she'd just invoked ancient law to challenge a vampire dynasty, and the human one, where she was just a janitor who hadn't slept in 2 days and desperately needed food. Constantine took her hand with no hesitation this time, fingers lacing through fingers like they'd been doing it for years instead of days, and he pulled her close and kissed her, slow and deep and anchoring, and it tasted like rain and relief and the beginning of something neither of them had words for yet. And Maya kissed him back with everything she had, with 6 years of loneliness and fear and believing she didn't matter, kissed him like he was oxygen and she was drowning. And when they finally broke apart, she was breathless and smiling, and he was looking at her like she'd hung the stars. He said, "I told you I'd ask properly," and his voice was soft and raw and everything Maya had ever wanted to hear. And he said, "Maya Torres, will you stay? Not as my witness or my protector? Not because vampire law binds you, or because you're caught in politics you didn't choose, but as the person I want to wake up beside when this is over. As the person who taught me how to speak again, and fight again and hope again." And Maya felt tears slip free and didn't bother wiping them away because she was done hiding, done pretending she didn't feel things, and she said, "I'm staying. I'm choosing you the same way you chose me, but you're buying me breakfast first because I haven't eaten in 2 days. And if I'm going to help you dismantle a government and survive a referendum and fight whatever Isadora throws at us next, I need pancakes. I need coffee. I need to sit in a normal diner and remember what ordinary feels like for 10 minutes. Constantine laughed again, and it was getting easier, the sound less rusty, more genuine, and he said, "Pancakes, coffee, normalcy, I think I can manage that." And they started walking hand in hand toward a 24-hour diner Maya could see glowing warm in the gray morning light, and Vasily fell into step 3 paces behind them, self-appointed bodyguard, and Maya glanced back and said, "You're coming too. You defected for us, which means you're fair game same as me." And Vasily said, "I'm aware, but someone needs to watch your backs while you're busy being disgustingly in love." And Maya felt her face heat, but she didn't deny it because it was true. She was in love with a vampire king who'd been silent for 36 years, in love with a man who'd reclaimed a throne just to keep her alive, and the love felt fragile and fierce and worth everything she'd risked to get here. They were halfway to the diner when Konstantine's phone buzzed, and he pulled it out one-handed, the other still holding Maya's, and his face went hard as he read whatever message had come through, and he showed her the screen. Unknown number. Message that read, "The referendum won't save you. I'll see you burn before I let a human dismantle what I built." And Maya knew it was Isadora. Knew the threat was real and immediate, and that the next 3 days would be dangerous in ways she couldn't fully predict. But she took the phone from Konstantine's hand and deleted the message and said, "Let her come, we'll be ready. We survived the council and the fair game clause and 2 assassination attempts. We can survive whatever she throws at us next." Konstantin looked at her like she was something rare and precious, and he said, "When did you get so brave?" And Maya said, "I've always been brave. I just didn't have a reason to show it until I met you." And Vasily said from behind them, "If you two are finished being adorable, we should keep moving. Standing still makes you easy targets." And Maya laughed because the absurdity of it all was finally hitting her. The fact that she was walking through Philadelphia at dawn with a vampire king and a defected enforcer, walking toward pancakes and coffee, and a future that was completely uncertain but also completely hers. Konstantin smiled, and it transformed his whole face, made him look younger despite the centuries in his eyes, made him look like someone who'd remembered how to be happy. And Maya thought, this is what I saved that night in the hospital. Not just his life, but his ability to smile like this, to hope like this, to choose love over isolation, and that's worth everything. Worth the danger and the politics and the war that's coming. They reached the diner, and the smell of coffee and bacon wrapped around Maya like a blanket, warm and ordinary and exactly what she needed. And they slid into a booth, Konstantin beside her and Vasily across from them, and the waitress came over with menus and didn't bat an eye at the fact that Konstantin was covered in fading bruises, and Maya looked like she'd been awake for 48 hours straight. And Vasily was wearing a suit that probably cost more than the diner's monthly revenue, and she just said, "Coffee all around," and Maya said, "Yes, please, and the strongest you've got." And Konstantin ordered pancakes for Maya and nothing for himself. And when she asked if vampires could eat, he said, "We can, but we don't need to. I just want to watch you remember what normal feels like." And Maya's heart did something complicated in her chest, and she thought, I'm keeping him. I'm keeping this moment. I'm keeping the memory of sunrise and coffee, and the man beside me who learned how to speak again because I asked him to stay. The coffee came hot and bitter and perfect, and Maya wrapped her hands around the mug and let the warmth seep into her bones, and she looked at Konstantin and Vasily and thought, this is my family now, this vampire king and this defected enforcer, this found family built from choice and desperation and the stubborn refusal to let the system erase us. And she said out loud, "Thank you, both of you, for choosing me back, for making me feel like I matter." And Konstantin's hand found hers under the table and squeezed once, gentle and certain, and Vasily said, "You invoked the right of the catalyst and fractured a centuries-old power structure, Maya Torres. I think you've proven you matter." And Maya laughed, and it felt good, felt like coming home to herself. The sun was fully up now, October lights spilling through the diner windows. And outside the city went about its business completely unaware that underneath the ordinary surface a revolution was brewing, and Maya thought, 3 days until the referendum, 3 days to convince every vampire in Philadelphia that autonomy matters more than control, that the binding program needs to end, and then whatever comes after that, whatever war Isadora starts, Whatever consequences ripple out from my choice to save one dying man in the rain, and she wasn't afraid anymore, wasn't waiting for permission to exist. She was choosing to fight, and choosing to love, and choosing to believe that kindness was power, not weakness. And beside her, Constantine was smiling that tired, genuine smile, the first real smile in 36 years. And Maya leaned her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes and let herself have this moment of peace before the storm, this moment of pancakes and coffee, and the man she loved finally believing he deserved to be saved. And she thought, whatever comes next, we face it together. And that's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything.